Martin Heidegger was born September 26th of 1889. Hailing from Meschkirch, Germany, he is regarded as one of the single most important German philosophers of all time. He is best known for the extremely influential work of Being and Time. To many today, Being and Time is one of the most important pieces of phenomenological and existential philosophy. Phenomenology being the actual phenomena that we experience, what we see, what we taste, what we smell, touch, hear, and feel. Instead of focusing or asking what we really are, it focuses on the phenomena that surrounds our lives. And with existentialism being the emphasis on individual existence and the freedom and choice that we all experience as human individuals. The core purpose of Being in Time is addressing the meaning of being. What is it to be? What is common to all entities that make them entities? These questions are so important, and the subsequent creation of Being in Time is hands down one of the most important pieces and turning points in philosophy today. Being in Time in Heideggerian philosophy is the backdrop of 20th century philosophy. Noting this and our future videos around political theory and philosophy, I'm considering this video as one of the single most important videos I make. Heidegger approaches these huge questions through the lens of Dasein, which roughly translates in English to simply being there. In order to get into Being in Time, we need to take a look at what Martin Heidegger is responding to and how he is fundamentally reacting to Enlightenment-era philosophy. Because from the time of Descartes, Locke, Kant, and even Hume, we typically looked at the world and human experience through the lens of subject and object. The subject being you, and the object being the world in which you imposed yourself on. The importance of this is the distinction and separation of you and the world. You are two separate things under this philosophy. This distinction between subject and object is something Heidegger doubts. There's something else extremely important here as well. When modern philosophers such as Descartes wanted to explain existence, they wanted to explain themselves. What Descartes ultimately did is he narrowed down his direct path of existence. And ultimately, the conclusion that Descartes came to about existence is that you can essentially strip everything away, and the only thing that provides proof of our existence is the fact that we think. It's the fact that I'm having thoughts to begin with. Therefore, I must be something. Therefore, I must be something that thinks. Yet, Heidegger notices something. He notices a flaw in this reasoning. This cannot be the first proof of our existence. In order to make that abstraction, in order to come up with the idea that I think, therefore I am, there has to be something before that. Before you think, you have to be. And simply being is the very first human experience that we have. This simple being that Heidegger is talking about before thought is ultimately what he is referring to as Dasein. Dasein is an incredibly hard concept to grasp, in my opinion, and it has been very difficult for me. But this human experience of being before thought, before anything else, seems to be the very best example I have stumbled across. Heidegger wanted to completely create new words for this. It may sound like philosophers of the past were talking about what Heidegger is talking about with being, but they really haven't. So in creating new words such as Dasein, he wanted to leave all the prior philosophical baggage behind. And even more importantly, with being and Dasein, Heidegger refers to being more specifically as being in the world. Like the fundamental rejection of subject and object, a person and the world as a separate entity, he views being as something as being hyphenated in the world. This is what he's ultimately referring to in Being in Time as simply being in the world. Because you ultimately can't be without the world. They're not two separate things. The world around you and being as yourself are completely interlinked and necessary for one another. The past modern idea of being a separate agent of the world, roaming around and navigating an external world, was incorrect in Heidegger's eyes, and it missed an incredibly important part of that Dasein, that being. This is why ultimately Martin Heidegger is writing this. He saw the fundamental flaws within Enlightenment-era philosophy and the tools used for their analysis. Heidegger believed that the ontology of the Enlightenment era was completely flawed from the get-go. Ontology being the actual philosophical study of the nature of being, becoming, and existence. Ontology typically deals with questions about what things exist and what can exist. Because for so long, people have been concerned with what existed. Yet there was one critical mistake that they made in asking this question. They haven't even fundamentally contended with what existence was. This is the ultimate backdrop and reasoning for Martin Heidegger's work, Being and Time. A cynical mind may ask the question, what's the point of this? What's the point of contending with being in the early 1900s? We've experienced a scientific revolution, created robust new political systems, new ways of material life for humanity. Why concern yourself necessarily with the idea of existence? The answer that Heidegger would likely give to this question is that being presupposes everything. Being is the backdrop for nearly every single thing in our lives and comes before every concept that we know and every field of study that we know, such as mathematics, science, physics, and the like. That is why this question of being and fundamentally figuring out what being is important. Because every single thing that we could talk about, every single thing that we could analyze is an already existing thing. Now, on to being. There's all kinds of different realms that exist for being. We understand entities as things, people, animals, concepts. But within these questions, fundamentally we must understand what it is to be human and the being that encapsulates humanity. When concerning ourselves with human epistemology being ultimately how we understand knowledge, we see that in a human context, we react and interact with things very distinctly. One very distinct human phenomena Heidegger noticed is that when we discover concepts or truth, the interlinked concepts and other truths that connect themselves to that singular truth often become completely blurred. One example of this is whenever you read, the very text that you are reading is the only real defined text. The text surrounding it becomes blurred. Ultimately, this manifests physically in our life as well. Another famous example of this is whenever you are hammering in a nail into a board, the hammer that you are using, that very tool, almost disappears from your direct consciousness. After hammering away for some time, you forget that the hammer is actually there. Heidegger calls this phenomena ready to hand. You typically only notice the tool or concept that is ready to hand whenever it doesn't work correctly or breaks. So say when you're hammering in the nail, the complete head of the hammer falls apart. You would instantly recognize that it is in your hand at that point. When you do notice this is what Heidegger calls present at hand. The importance of these terms and concept present at hand and ready to hand is that Heidegger ultimately wants to convey to us that the world is to be discovered. It isn't necessarily blank and given to us, but ultimately it is right underneath our nose. To many people, the mark of a great philosopher, the mark of a great academic or teacher, is someone who can explain things that deeply and inherently we already know, but haven't externally formulated it verbally or even consciously. The further conceptual importance of ready to hand to Heidegger is something that many people often miss in his work. When Enlightenment-era philosophers ask the question of what exists whenever they partake in the ontology of the time, existence to them was essentially ready to hand. They never took the fundamental steps in discovering what existence and being really was. Because Enlightenment-era philosophers weren't the only victims of this. This ready-at-hand phenomena is a very human phenomena. Heidegger noticed something extremely important. As human beings living within a society, we often go about our lives in an incredibly robotic way. And this roboticism comes from the very human experience of simply blurring everything out. The world is made up of concepts. The world is made up of tools. And the more humans interact with those tools and concepts, the more they sort of disappear. The more they almost become unimportant. We do this with definitions in language. We do this with relationships. My boyfriend or girlfriend broke up with me and I didn't know what I had until it was gone. In a weird way, we almost just accept this preordained essence in our lives. we accept weird roles designed from society, our family, and even peer group. Heidegger points out we have a tendency to live in what he calls the everydayness. The everydayness is often what separates the inauthentic human experience and the authentic human experience. One's sense of self, of what one is to do with their life and how one is supposed to live, for the most part, is given from the outside and an inauthentic experience of life. Heidegger calls this inauthenticity of life Verfallen, which translates into fallenness. Ultimately, he is trying to elaborate on the everydayness of our life, in which Dasein's immersion of the world and our being in the world revolves around menial traditions, rituals, and the social expectations that society imprints on us. But according to Heidegger, there is a being in which we escape Verfallen. We can almost look past the everydayness of life. Heidegger explains the how in Befindlichkeit. I think I said that right. Befindlichkeit translates roughly into how one finds oneself. Our being finds itself in a situation where one is radically thrown into the world from birth. A birth in which no one really asked for. This is where we get into the existentialism of Heidegger and its philosophical relation to others such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Soren Kierkegaard, and even Simone de Beauvoir. Heidegger calls this mode of understanding our being Verstehen, which roughly translates to understanding. And the understanding mainly points towards the infinite amount of possibilities that we have in our life within the finite span of time. With Dasein being in the world, on the opposite of the finite spectrum of life, we have Das Nichts, which roughly translates into nothing. This is likely symbolized as death, as completely void, as something at the end of the journey. Heidegger saw the realization of the finite span of time that we have as the ultimate gateway towards authenticity and the ultimate gateway towards being in the world. Because ultimately, understanding time and our place within it is ultimately understanding Dasein. It's understanding our being in the world. It's right here that the notion of being and time are brought together. In essence, time is the form of human life, according to Heidegger. The structural moments where we contend with time mentally is what Heidegger calls a temporal ecstasy. The ahead of itself manifests as the futural, the very future. The already in a world manifests the past or having been, anything that has been in the past. And being, alongside, manifests the present. Actualization of the other two moments is what ultimately creates our conception of the present. Heidegger quotes this as follows: "We reach out towards the future while taking up our past, thus yielding our present activities. Note how the future, and hence the aspect of possibility, has priority over the other two moments." In essence, being able to understand the future and past, being able to understand the past where at once was birth, then the impending future of death, creates the ultimate understanding of the present. Not only does it create the ultimate understanding of the present as a conception, but as a manifested reality, a reality of the finite and our finite amount of time here.
Because it is an anxiety before the fear of nothingness. It's an anxiety in the face of death. Don't want to make it sound, too scary, but I've already said it is a democratic institution. It is something you need to deal with. And again, we're looking for universal structures. One of the structures of all stories about the selves, even the ones we tell ourselves, no matter how disconnected they may be, they end in this rather interesting institution, death. Very interesting institution. Well, he examines the mood of anxiety then, not as a mere mood that just comes upon you once in a while, but as an underlying structure of what it means to be human.
Thus the crowd, thus the inauthentic life, the socially imposed norms become far less attractive. Heidegger argued this is when we become authentic, when we interact with the world and being with the understanding of the finite. We start to do things because we want to, not necessarily because we have to follow along with the norm. Further, Heidegger's understanding of unity and the unity of being is incredibly important in a physical and even non-physical level. Since being is being, it is the fundamental backdrop behind everything. You, the plants, the animals, and even concepts behind everything is simply being. And with the term throness, as we discussed beforehand, you are thrusted into the world, into being. This supposes a level of unity between everything, a unity of you, a unity of the world. Further, the structure of Heideggerian philosophy and analytics show that concepts and things cannot exist without you, since existence only exists within our perception, and the reality without our perception is completely irrelevant to our existence. A good example of this is if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it or see it, and no one ever finds it, did it actually happen? Heidegger would likely respond as if that just simply didn't matter at all. And he would further respond with, it completely depends on the perspective in which you are coming from. Do you hold the perspective of a Trump supporter? Do you hold the perspective of a Nazi or an ex-Nazi? Maybe a bona fide political liberal? The date and time and the perspective in which you hold the being of something changes that being in its entirety. Therefore, dealing with things outside our sphere of being is not very sensical philosophy to Heidegger. This is just another aspect in what time plays in our being. The implication of being in time is immense in the world. Heidegger is ultimately teaching us to become far more vulnerable people, far more vulnerable humans, understanding our direct conceptual and physical unity with everything in the world. Further, we must be completely aware of the infinitude of ideas, the infinite number of perceptions that may come to us throughout our finite period of time between birth and death. Therefore, we must occasionally check our dogmatism. We should occasionally check our biases. And in doing this, recognizing our unity, recognizing the infinite amount of ideas and perceptions that may come to us, we hit a place of human authenticity. Further, Heidegger expresses that there are ways to understand Dasein. There are ways to understand being a being and understanding being. Separating yourself from the mundaneness of general life and society, the day-to-dayness, going to work, and general responsibilities. Taking a walk in the middle of nowhere, taking a walk in the woods, perceiving the unity in everything around you. Heidegger expresses a type of specialness in human being, in simply being a human. And this specialness of being is something we should not take for granted. We should be fully aware of our unity, of our closeness to nature, our closeness to other animals, beings, and even the conceptual relationship with concepts. Understanding this vulnerability of ourselves is what will create a more authentic human, an authentic self, and ultimately, a more authentic life. Thank you guys so much for watching. This was hands down the most difficult video I have had to make. Heidegger, hands down, is the most difficult philosopher for me to understand, and even secondary resources on him were extremely difficult to siphon through. So the world, always in the mode of representing subject, but argues... I don't understand a fucking goddamn thing here. This video over being in time is an only one-part video of a three-part series. The next video coming up will be Heidegger's work on the question of technology, which is honestly probably my favorite work of his. But you could never talk about the question of technology without talking about being in time and his concepts before it. Ultimately, with this video, what I've wanted to do is I wanted to create a video that no one really has been able to pull off. I noticed some videos on Heidegger are extremely analytical and they're extremely good at explaining his logic and concepts, but they ultimately fail to mention the real world implications that we would probably feel. And then further, there are other videos talking about the real world implications and the physical reality of his work, yet they kind of fail to mention his actual important concepts and his important logic behind his work. Hopefully I was able to pull this off. But as always, guys, if you did enjoy the video, please leave a like. If you want to see more, feel free to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Also, I have a Twitch channel. I stream Tuesday, Thursday, Friday at 7 o'clock, and it would be cool to hang out with you guys. Also, if you guys want to join the Discord down below, feel free to reach out to me, talk to me anytime, and or reach out to me on my socials. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and thank you for the support.